David Axelrod, Bob Bauer, and Nate Pursley. Thank you all very much for that great conversation. We're going to move now to one fundamental aspect that this conversation touched on, not so much the voting technology, that'll be later, but actually voter registration technology, which is a key element in really expanding the electorate and making sure the voting experience is as efficient and effective as possible and fair in the process. So please join me in welcoming our next panel to the stage. We referred to ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, and we're pleased to have with us today John Lindback, who's Executive Director of ERIC, the first executive director which was formed in that organization in May of 2012 by 7 pioneering states to improve the accuracy of the voter registration rolls and access to voter registration for U.S. citizens. Also with us, Tammy Patrick, who is a member of the Presidential Commission and a federal compliance officer for Maricopa County and the Arizona Elections Department. Christopher Thomas, another fellow commission member and director of elections for the Michigan Department of State. And finally with us to moderate this conversation, Martha Moore, who covers national politics as a reporter for USA Today. Please join me in welcoming all of them to Blueprint for Implementation. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. And I think with this distinguished panel, we all know who's the hack on this forum, in this forum. I think what we're going to talk about in this panel is not the broad overview that you just got, but the nitty-gritty of how to implement one of the Election Commission's biggest recommendations, which was to modernize the voter registration system. And there are a couple of ways I think that can be addressed. Online voter registration has gotten the most play, but it's not the only aspect of that. But the registration process, it's not, my impression, and I want Tammy to address this, is it's not, we've heard a lot about the number of people who are not registered, but modernizing voter registration is not necessarily only about expanding voter registration, it's really about improving the accuracy of it. Is that not true? Because it has such ramifications when it comes to an election.
That's absolutely accurate, and good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. One of the things that I wanted to point out has to do with, I'll turn my mouth a little bit here, has to do with the fact that the report talks about voter registration modernization in a variety of ways. As was mentioned, we have online voter registration, but we also have things like the interstate projects that were talked about in the first panel, and intrastate projects, the exchange of data within state governments to improve the quality of the data itself. But we also recommend things that have to do with some of our more unique subsets of our voting population, like the federal postcard application and the federal write-in absentee ballot that impact our military and overseas voters. And we even discuss e-poll books because that too has a great impact on the voter on election day in the polling place itself. But why did we have voter registration modernization as such a key element of our report? And that's because it's really foundational in the entire electoral process. If you have a foundation that you're using to draw your district lines, to allocate your resources, how many poll workers are you going to hire, how many pieces of voting equipment, how many booths, all of these things are being based on our voter rolls. And when our voter rolls are either inflated or they're not accurate, and we have, as was mentioned earlier, an excess of turnout, that's because we're not managing things as well as we potentially could. So it's really, really critical that these things are being done accurately. Part of what an offshoot of that can be is that you'll have the increase of provisional ballots that were mentioned earlier. And when the technology is available for us to improve the quality of our rolls, it will just trickle down to the entire process and make sure that things are more accurate. And that includes more convenience to the voters themselves, more transparency of the process, greater security, greater integrity in the process. So I really think that this is one of the critical aspects of election administration in this country, that if we can get it away from the paper-based system that we've had to the next century, then I think that it'll be very, very impactful to our population. We will have a more in-depth dive on online voter registration later on today, and I think it's critical that we're not advocating that every voter should have to register to vote online. I don't think we'll ever get to a point where the paper form is completely gone, but if we can increase the amount of access our voters have electronically, that would be very important.
So when I'm a voter standing in a long, long line to vote, part of the reason that I'm there, or the main reason that I'm there, is because 20 people in front of me are having trouble with their voter, they're not registered accurately, or they're in the wrong place? It all goes back to the database of voter registration, is that right?
It does, and it goes back to the research that demonstrates that our voting population, very interestingly, most of them feel that we're automatically updating their voter registration when they move and they notify the post office that they've had a change of address. Our population thinks that that information's getting to the state and they're able to automatically update their registration. Now, some states do that and others do not without an affirmed written statement from the voter on a voter registration form. So there's that conflict. And we also have, in the report, we call for enforcement of the National Voter Registration Act and a couple of other federal laws. We didn't make any comment on doing any new additional laws, but we felt that if we enforced the laws that we already have in the books, that would be helpful. So if we had enforcement for the Department of Motor Vehicles, which my colleague will speak to, and the NVRA agencies to actually comply with federal law and offer voter registration and make sure that that was being done in compliance with those laws, that the individuals standing in line truly would have had their information updated as they assumed was happening, and it wasn't just being lost in the shuffle.
Well, in fact, that was one of the parts of the Commission's report that kind of, I think, made my jaw drop, and maybe I'm easily surprised, but maybe other people as well. And Chris, I think you wanted to mention this. There's actually, we've had for 20 years a law that's supposed to make it easy to update your voter registration or to register to vote when you when you get your driver's license or change your driver's license. But apparently that's just not happening.
It's not happening very well, that is for sure. And again, thank you for the invitation to be here. I think these are great events to move this forward. If you look at the NVRA, it's monumental legislation that came through that actually moved the requirement and the initiative to registration to the government somewhat. And the government was then supposed to ask every voter when they came in to change their driver's license address or to apply for a new one to register to vote.
This is the motor voter.
This is motor voter and the NVRA. Michigan started this back in 1975, so I've got somewhat of an invested interest here. And it's worked very well. We do 84% of our state's registrations come through our DMV. And when you think about that, you know, the first thing people do, they may go to the post office to change their address, but then they go to the DMV to change their driver's license address. And voter registration is way down the list, particularly when you're outside of the election periods. The number of provisional ballots that result because their driver's license is entirely accurate as to where they live, but their voter registration is not. So they're in the polling place, they're going through this whole process of stepping out of line and doing a provisional ballot that may or may not be counted sometime after the election. Very inefficient way to do it. So as government came in, and then ironically, we're kind of giving it back to everybody through online registration, which is a fine compliment. We still, as a commission, thought it was necessary to see the enforcement of the NVRA. That works, and where it has been used and used well, the citizens are very well informed. It's really time that this country gets beyond voter registration. It's a problem that should not be a problem. It ought to just kind of happen transparently. And we're not there yet. So for example, in Michigan, we do 84% of our transactions come from the DMV. Here in Illinois, only 40% come from the DMV. So if the Secretary of State in Illinois were pushing the DMV to be more aggressive in terms of asking every person and transmitting that data, there would be fewer lines in the state of Illinois, for example. There would be fewer provisional ballots. So I think it's something that we really need to take a look at nationally I quite frankly think the Department of Justice ought to get involved. They've not been shy about enforcing the law, other portions of the NVRA, and they shouldn't be shy about enforcing this.
But why is there such, I think the Pew people are one of the co-sponsors of this event, recently tried to look into Motor-Voter to see if they could assess how well states are implementing it, and they found that there wasn't even enough data, if I'm not misstating it. There wasn't even enough, nobody kept enough data for anybody to be able to evaluate it. Why have the states been so lax on following Motor-Voter? Is there any, I mean, not all states have, obviously,
Right.
and there are obviously some states where the DMV's own processes are not sufficient to, like, they're doing it all on paper, so there's really not much advantage to trying to register you to vote.
Yeah,
But why have the states, really not, it's been 20 years.
Well, everybody needs a boss. And sometimes someone needs to come back and to tell them that this is part of your mission. And it's quite frankly, DMVs around the country do not see this as part of their mission. The DMVs, look, they've got a tough job. They've got lines out their door. They've got a lot of work coming in of the same citizens day in and day out. But until they decide that this is part of their mission, it's not going to get done. Now, the Pew Trust did a great deal in March by bringing together election officials and DMV directors. And quite frankly, when David Becker read the provisions of the NVRA out loud, you could see in the DMV directors a lot of puzzlement in terms of, really, those are pretty strict, straightforward laws. I don't think I've heard of that before. I mean, I knew we had voter registration forms here, but I didn't really think that we were supposed to do anything with them. And they are. The law is very prescriptive. It's very clear. So until it's part of the mission, it's not going to happen. Now, what we saw in the commission was the state of Delaware. Now, Michigan, I can brag about Michigan, but we're totally integrated. It's been a long process of integrating computer systems. Costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. Delaware's come along, and they've done a system that works very nicely without all of the electronic computer integration. It's something to turn around for a lower dollar figure and a quicker time period. So they're up 78% of their transactions are coming through the Motor-Voter. And it's all electronic, no paper. The voter signs it all on the keypad, makes their signature there, answers the questions. And then the data goes right off to the state voter registration system rather than going back into the DMV and finding its way down to election officials. So we have the prototype of the low-cost, quick way to do it. And now it's getting the AAMVA, the Motor Vehicles Association, and the various states on board to say, you have, and let's be frank, most DMVs report to governors. Some to secretaries of state like Michigan and Illinois, but most of them report to governors. This is a voting rights issue. And the voters have the right to be registered and to have it under federal law, to have their records updated on a timely basis. And it's really quite discriminatory in the sense of not asking somebody when they're right there, they're changing their license, and you could make them whole in terms of voting. So until it's part of the mission, it's going to be a long uphill battle. And sometimes it takes court cases to get people to appreciate mission.
So if states had been more aggressive with Motor-Voter, how much of the problem that we currently have would have been obviated?
Well, I'm going to give an example. I'm sorry, Matt. I know you're here somewhere. Matt Masterson, good friend from Ohio, a state south of us. Now, their Motor-Voter is being vastly improved during the last couple of years, but they were at 14%. And they had over 200,000 provisional ballots. Most of those were change of addresses. In Michigan, we had 2,600. So there's your difference in terms of people are properly updated. The number of provisional ballots is going to decrease significantly.
I think, last question on Motor-Voter. I think I read somewhere that although there was, Motor-Voter also covered social service agencies, correct?
Yes.
But the previous panel talked a little bit about the discriminatory effects of voter ID, and I know one of the earlier speakers was concerned that most of the people who aren't registered are disproportionately minority and disadvantaged. But I think this data show, I think there's data that shows that that population does register, but doesn't necessarily use social service agencies, correct?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. We have just done a study in Michigan, 1.8 million recipients of public assistance that's on their rolls. And we compared the voter registration. We had full social number or last four digits. So we got a great match. So we found that 75% of those people on that file are registered voters. So it's a good percentage that are registered voters. 75% of those voters registered at the DMV, not at the social services. Only, I believe, 10% filed in the agencies. Another 10% went to the clerk's office, and the rest was by mail. So when people tend to think in silos. They think, oh, well, people that need public assistance, well, they just register at the Department of Social Services. Well, that's not true. Motor voter crosses all strata. That's the beauty of this system, is that it touches all strata. And this data, which I think is first in the country, really shows that it also has an adverse effect on the recipients of public assistance when motor voter is not properly functioning.
Tammy?
If I could just add on to that, I think that's also a critical point to think about when the states are moving forward on online voter registration, because the majority of the states are using that coupled with the Department of Motor Vehicles as a mechanism for getting the signature for the voter for when they do voting by mail, petition verification, that sort of thing. So I think it is critical to know that the vast majority of our voting population are using the Department of Motor Vehicles, and when it functions well, even if they're going into the office or they're choosing to use an online service, that we will touch on quite a large portion of the population.
Well, now, so we've talked about online registration and we've talked about motor voter as two potential ways to basically improve your database. That's what this is about, right? But there's also data matching with other jurisdictions, and that is what John is doing with ERIC, correct?
Correct. ERIC stands for the Electronic Registration Information Center. It was formed in May 2012 with the generous support of the Pew Charitable Trusts. And after about 2.5 years of extensive planning that Pew organized that included elections officials from throughout the country and academics, Pew helped the organization get started, but it is now fully operational and self-governing and self-supporting and independent of Pew. It's run by the member states. They have a membership agreement. There are 2 full-time employees, and they're routinely uploading their voter registration data and their DMV data. And ERIC is matching that data and sending reports back out to the member states. We're also recruiting new members. Currently, there are 10 states that are part of ERIC. There were 7 that originally formed it back in 2012, and those 7 states were Washington, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado in the west, and Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland in the east. We had 3 new members at the beginning of this year, and that is Connecticut, the District of Columbia, and Oregon. We have a number of states that have adopted legislation that would enable them to join ERIC. The 2 most recent examples of that are Minnesota and Louisiana. Other states include North Carolina and South Carolina, Arizona, Ohio. And we have one state, the one we're sitting in right now, Illinois, that has a bill pending before the legislature. I'd like to talk for a second about the reports that the states get back once you match that data. When you match the DMV data and the voter registration data, you're going to get a bunch of people, as we've just heard about, that have a more recent address at the DMV. and have moved within a state. And so each of the member states gets a report about those in-state movers. Here are people whose address in the DMV, or excuse me, in the voter registration database is old. You also get a report of cross-state movers. Here are people who have moved to another member state in ERIC. ERIC also matches its data against the National or Social Security Death Index, and so they get a report that shows deceased individuals still on the voter rolls. ERIC can also analyze each state's voter registration database and look for duplicates within that database. And finally, for those people that are on the DMV list but are not on the voter registration list, ERIC provides each member state with a list of individuals who are potentially eligible to vote but are as yet unregistered. I'd like to just give you a few of the numbers that have resulted from the original 7 states, because the other 3 that have just joined are just uploading their data now. So these numbers just reflect the current 7 states. In-state movers among those 7 states, we've reported out 1.49 million of those to just those 7 states. Cross-state movers, about 251,000. Deceased individuals on those state rolls, almost 57,000. And in-state duplicates, about 30,000. The data is solid. The matching technology is very sophisticated as you can get in this business. And the states and the local election officials are reporting widespread satisfaction with the quality of the data that they're getting. In terms of the numbers of those people who are not registered, the ERIC data that has been distributed amounts to about 6.1 million names of people who are potentially eligible to vote but were not registered.
Have any of the states reached out to those people?
Yes, the ERIC membership agreement requires the states to send a piece of mail to those individuals, giving them information on how to register to vote, and the ERIC members have all done that.
Did they show any result? Do we know if it worked?
They did show results, some very good results. And some of that information is on our website. You can also talk to individual members. Judge Hout from Colorado has done excellent analysis and can talk about that as well. I'd like to talk for a second about the state that we're in, because when people talk to us about joining ERIC, we provide them lots of information. And I provided information to Illinois based on the experience of the current member states, what their reports would be likely to show for the state of Illinois if they were to join ERIC. And if Illinois was to join today, it's highly likely that the reports would show about 408,000 people in Illinois have a more recent address at the DMV than they do in the state voter registration database. That about almost 85,000 people that are in the current database have moved out of state, and Illinois doesn't know it yet. That there are about, based on the current member states, 17,400 deceased individuals still on Illinois' rolls.
Insert Cook County joke.
Yes. And, you know, these numbers you have to take, these are averages of what's happened in the current states applied to Illinois' total numbers. So these numbers could be lower or higher depending on how well Illinois is doing at maintaining its list right now. In terms of in-state duplicates, there would be about 10,500 of those within the Illinois rolls. These numbers help a prospective state sort of plan on the costs of the mailings and that kind of thing, and that's why we provide that information to them.
How much does it cost to join ERIC?
Each state pays a $25,000 initiation fee, and then they pay annual dues that depend upon 2 things. Well, 3 things. The size of ERIC's budget, which is about $500,000 a year, and will remain relatively static. The number of states in ERIC, and then the voting age eligible population of the state. And so the result of those 3 factors mean that the more populous states pay a higher amount of dues than the small states. Illinois would pay more money than Delaware, for example.
I have a question about Eric, but I think we might need to take some questions from the audience. Is it time for that? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to know, how does the air system affect college students?
Wait, do you have a mic?
I would like to know how the ERIC system of voting affects college students. You have students coming from other states into a new state, and also ones that go out of state to go
Good
to school.
question. How do you filter out college students with the data matching? Or how do you address mobile college students?
Well, the college students are treated like any other member of the population to the extent that they register to vote. If they move, if they have a new address in another state, Eric will be able to tell their old state sooner rather than later that they've moved, enabling the new state to reach out to them, enabling the old state to reach out to them and ask them if they can cancel that registration. So this combination of data that helps you reach out to people who have moved, plus data that tells you who's not registered in your state, would be an asset to college students, just like anyone else.
Tammy?
If I could just add on to that, I think all of the programs and the things that we're talking about and the things that are in the report are looking really at a leveling of the voter registration of individuals who want to register or who would register or who are registered but need to update information. So those of you who do any sort of voter registration or GOTV, or you've used a canvassing list and you've seen how there's old information on it and you've wasted your time and resources trying to use that list, you know that voter registration goes along at pretty much nothing until right before a presidential election or right before a midterm, and we get that glut. And that's part of the issue, that all of these are trying to level that workload out and identify these voters before that time period, when everyone who's involved in any sort of election, whether you're an administrator, an outreach worker, a candidate running for office, the last thing you want to be dealing with is voter registration and getting information that's correct. We want to try and level that out earlier on so that the process can be far more efficient.
Did you have a question, sir?
I'm very fascinated with the Michigan mission emphasis there, and the young college student here who asked about how you track college students. I was quite pleased here in Chicago and Cook County when the high school students, who are currently 17, were able to participate in an election cycle that reflected an upcoming election. And I was wondering, since we always hear the negativity about Chicago and Cook County, how attuned is the rest of the country with such a progressive approach to getting young people proactively involved ahead of their actual birthday?
Well, I would think that Motor Voter would be a good way to get young kids to register, since they all want to get their driver's license.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to get them in as motor voter. Some states will have different ages, whether it's 17, 17 and a half. There are states that are actually pre-registering students at 16 or young people at 16 and 17. And with the computer systems, then they just kind of automatically appear on the rolls when they hit their 18th birthday.
Does Michigan have pre-registration?
We do, well, it's 17, but not 16, no.
And additionally, there was one other recommendation in the report that deals directly with your point, and that is many states allow 16 and 17-year-olds to work the polls as poll workers, even though they're not yet registered to vote, in limited capacities, whether they're a line walker or they're the ones designated to setting up the equipment. So that's another way to get them involved, and research shows that they then become registered, and not only register at a higher rate than their counterparts, but they actually participate more frequently.
Yes, sir. With the beard.
You said, I wanted to ask the question because you talked about, well, it really wasn't you, but the time before, it talked about black males, why they're low turnouts. Well, I think that one thing that has not been looked at is that incarceration. In 1963, before the Voting Rights Act, the black population in the prison system was like 28%. I think now in the national population it's more like 62%. So maybe one of the reasons that you don't see black males coming to vote because they're in the penitentiary. As it relates to this whole thing, I think that when we talk about voter registration, it should come like a birth certificate if you're an American. You know, I think that when you're born, you should be given a voter registration number. just like you give it a birth certificate. Every American citizen has the right to vote. You know, and I don't see what's so difficult for us to be able to put that in place. Seems that when you're born, we give you a voter registration number. As of your so-and-so birthday, it activates. You can use this number anywhere in the country. You wouldn't have to have, all you have to do is have that number that says you're a voter this is your voter registration number.
Well,
So,
is that kind of thing anything that anybody's thinking about? Portable voter registration?
I mean,
Nobody-
are
they're
we
leaping
American
to answer
citizens
it.
or what? Are we American citizens or what? My only question is, where you are on that given day, you should still be able to vote absentee in your state.
Yeah.
So you're mobile no matter what.
Yeah.
We already have mobile voting. The thing is that the participation, I always say, we live in a democracy, but we don't live in a democracy. Because we live in a democracy, we would want people to participate. It's more like people, they don't want you to participate. Give you an example. They asked in Chicago for participation in redistricting. Well, I submitted a map for the county and for the city. And in those two maps, retrogression, the city council and the Cook County board turned in a retrogressive map. If you don't know, it means that it was less black elected officials put on this new map than the old map. Well, they thought that they could go with a 55% rule. I'm telling you, you violate Voting Rights Act. You know, you gave us less Hispanic wards and less African American wards.
So
you
what can the
start talking
panel
about,
answer for you?
Pardon?
What can the panel answer for you?
Well, my question is, why isn't it? We talk about this. Why haven't I heard the proposal of when you're born, you're given a voter registration number?
Okay, let's talk about portable voter registration.
Well,
John.
this isn't normally my wheelhouse, but you know, I tend to stay straight in the lane on Eric. But given my history as an elections administrator, I mean, one of the things I was always told is one of the reasons we haven't gone there is because of the national ID debate and concerns by a lot of people in this country that they do not want a national ID, and that to go there would be politically challenging, to say the least. I think as far as close as anyone's come actually was in the state of Oregon, where I live recently, where the Secretary of State had a bill in the legislature that would automatically register to vote anyone on the DMV list that wasn't currently on the voter registration list. She would send them a piece of mail and say, we're going to register you to vote, and if you don't respond, if you do respond, you can opt out. That piece of legislation failed by one vote in the Oregon legislature, so she came very close to getting what many people considered to be America's first universal registration bill, and she's going to try again. So I think for folks who are interested in that kind of concept, that's a state to watch and a Secretary of State to watch.
Yes, ma'am.
Your very good presentation on Eric stopped short of what voting administrators in the states do with the information once they get it. And since we have this bubbling up in Illinois, I thought it would be good if you would explain, you know, what happens when people get that, when the secretaries of state get that information.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, well, the ERIC membership agreement requires each member state to reach out to those individuals. And so if you are an in-state mover and you appear in that, then the state is required to send a piece of mail to the person at the new address, the best address, that says, it appears to us that you have moved. We'd like you to update your voter registration. Here's how to do that. Now, most of the ERIC states have online registration, and so they're instructing people on what the website is and how they can go to that website to update their registration. The same thing is true to the people who have moved out of state. They are sent a piece of mail saying, can we cancel your registration in the old state? The new state encourages them to register as someone who may not yet be registered in that state. For the deceased individuals on the rolls, the state laws vary, but they deal with those in the same way that they deal with it if they got information from another source on that somebody had died. As far as the potentially eligible but unregistered, the states are required to send each of those people a piece of mail that says, it appears to us that you may be eligible to vote. Here's how to do it in the state. And that's part of the requirement. So there's an outreach requirement for basically each one of those.
Could you talk a little bit about, there is another data matching consortium, the Interstate Voter Registration Cross-Check Program, that is what Nate personally referred to as the Kansas Project, and it has 24 states in it. What's the material difference between the two of you? Is this Macy's and Gimbel's, or?
Well, it was touched on a bit this morning, and they are very different programs, both worthwhile. The Kansas Project is a look back at what happened and was born out of, as was explained this morning, a concern about voter fraud. And what that project looks for is double voting. Have people voted in, are people registered in more than one state, and are they voting in more than one state? And so they look back at the voting history in the prior election and are comparing lists. Tammy and Chris their states have both been part of that program, so they can probably add to that.
So Arizona's been part of the Kansas Consortium for a number of years, and the way that I usually distinguish the two is that the Kansas Project is comparing two voter registration lists from two states against each other. Just one list to one list with a certain number of fields that are being reviewed, whereas with the ERIC project, it's multiple lists, so you can find the subtleties of name changes. I personally don't use my formalized name on everything that I use. I go by Tammy a lot, not Tamra is when my mother's yelling at me or I have to get on a plane. And so it's a different type of data matching. The other thing that I think is a really critical piece of distinction between the two is that the Kansas Consortium, as John said, is looking back just at a single list, at a single election of who voted in that election and searching for duplicate registrations. And that's where, in Arizona, we have a lot of people who live in cold places some of the year, and then they move to Arizona when those places get cold. We have a lot of Cubs fans down in the Phoenix area. I'm just saying, we love y'all coming down there for spring training. So in reality, what we're finding is that people that are registered in two places, the vast majority of them are not voting in two places. They're voting in one place when they're there, they're voting in the other place when they're there. But we do find people who have cast ballots in the same federal election in both places. And to the question about college students in the past, none of the individuals we found who were voting in two places were college students. They were, in fact, our retirees.
Older people.
I just got the signal, but I'm going to ask one last question, because I get to. Chris, in your experience as one of the founders and the president of the National Association of State Elections Directors, how many of our audience is going to go back to their state and say, I heard a bunch of really great ideas, and be told, we don't have any money, sorry? And would that affect their success?
Well, first of all, I'm not the president any longer. I'm the past president. The president is here from
You'll
Gary
always be
Polzer.
president to me.
Yeah. I think what you go back is there is a lot of this that doesn't take money. Okay, the DMVs, they would need some money to get going, but the cost savings are tremendous. The online registration essentially is a minimal amount to turn that on and get it running, and has great cost saving benefits. Dealing with schools and all of that, again, these are not big capital programs. And in fact, through the HHS grants we've been getting, we've been making a lot of schools accessible. So I don't think this is a real big ticket funding issue, as opposed to say, geez, everyone ought to go buy a new voting system. You know, now you're talking about a couple $2 billion state or countrywide. But to implement this is not high numbers, high money.
Final thoughts, John and Tammy?
Yeah, same thing is true for states to join ERIC. Yes, there are costs up front, but it saves you money in the long run to have a more accurate voter registration list in so many ways. And also, states are already spending enormous amounts of money on list maintenance, and yet they still have inaccurate lists. I was talking to the director from New Jersey the other day, and I said, how much is your list maintenance budget? $1.7 million. What they would pay to join ERIC is small in comparison to what they're already spending, and would improve their list considerably.
A bargain.
Yeah.
I think it's important for jurisdictions to really know what they're spending their money on and how important good voter registration lists really do play. If you look at return mail, all of the things that you're mailing out that if you had better lists, you wouldn't be mailing that information out. In Maricopa County alone, we had a huge number of provisional ballots that had to do with our individuals who were on our permanent early voting list. But we spent over $600,000 on mailing out ballots to voters. They didn't vote the ballot, they went to the polls, we had a provisional ballot there. $600,000. Now, if we had been able to front load that, the voter experience would have been greatly improved. So it's really knowing where you're spending your money, what it's being spent on, and if there's a way to shift those resources in a much more productive manner that will improve your lives as well as the voters' experience.
Great. Thank you all very much. You were all really interesting and informed.